Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual education session. We've been really excited with how these have gone so far, and I think this topic that we're all here for tonight is incredibly relevant and interesting and of use both in all times, but particularly right now with the challenges that clubs are facing during the pandemic. Just a little bit of housekeeping per my email this morning, and for those of you that have been on these before, please keep yourself on mute while Barb presents and throughout the presentation. You can use the chat function at the bottom to communicate to me or to each other also. I think sometimes there is group conversation that helps in these presentations, and the chat can sort of serve that purpose. If you have questions that you want to pose to Barb at the end, use the chat function to send them to me. I'll keep a tally, and then after she finishes the presentation portion, I will call on you to unmute yourself, and you can ask Barb that question kind of one-on-one. We're also going to try something new. We have polling options in our Zoom account, and so Barb has built in some polls to her presentation. So she'll note one, I'll launch it, and just answer, and we can sort of use those results to direct the line of presentation as Barb goes. This is anonymous. I mean, these questions are pretty simple and nothing that would be too odd or awkward to answer, but you know, we don't know who's saying what. It's just to give a general read on things. With that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Barb Jewell. Barb has held leadership positions in both the Badgerland Striders and the Racine Area Running Club in her home state of Wisconsin. She is a past president, past treasurer, and a past race director for the Racine Area Running Club, and I've learned is now on the finance committee for the Badgerland Striders. She became the RRCA Wisconsin state rep in 2007 and is going to be turning over the reins for that very soon, so stay tuned. She has served on the RRCA finance committee and as of this spring is now the RRCA treasurer. So with that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce Barb Jewell.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all having a good Monday. And I'm pleased to be with you here this evening to talk about financial management for running clubs. I think an important topic at any time, but especially in these uncertain times, I think even more important than ever. So let's dive right in. So there's a picture of me. We'll go by that. And we'll talk about best practices in financial management, hopefully give you some ideas of some things that you may want to adopt in your running club. And then towards the end, we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about, given these unusual times that we're in, just some food for thought about planning for 2021. So you might say, why does a running club need a financial management policy? Well, we want to make sure we've given some thought to some key objectives and written them down. Things like making sure we have adequate income and cash flow and reserves. And obviously, it's important to make sure that financial records are accurate and timely. And we want to be prudent and control our spending, protect the club from fraud or theft, and compliance with regulations at the local, state, and federal level are also important and can be covered in a financial management policy. So here's a list of some of the things we're going to talk about, various best practice items. Okay, hang on a second, sorry. Something's not working. Give me a second. My computer is frozen up for some reason. Let's see.
If you need me to try to fire it up on my end, I can do that, but see if yours unfreezes.
Hang on.
Sure.
I know why it happened because I moved this little.
Cold right now in the Midwest, so
Yes.
we had some snow yesterday, excuse me, in Minnesota.
Andy, hang on, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll try sharing again. And hopefully it should work. Otherwise, we'll go with Andy. Yes, you did have some snow, didn't you, Lisa? Let's see here. Okay, we're in business.
All right.
All right, so first thing to think about is that important, critical position in your club of treasurer. And, you know, this is one of those, I think, key positions in a club where you need something more than an enthusiastic volunteer. That's certainly necessary, but you really do need somebody with the appropriate skills, who's detailed and logical and orderly. And I think almost as important as some of those kinds of skills is time available to do the job. You know, the work of a treasurer takes a pretty big commitment. So, you know, I've seen cases where there was a qualified person who really wanted to do the job, but they had trouble finding time to adequately do the job. You know, maybe they were working 60 hours a week at their, you know, their real job. And so having time available to do the job is really key. And another thing that I think is important is that you might want to consider is doing a background check and a credit check on the treasurer. You know, with it being such a key position with access to all the money in the club, you certainly don't want somebody who has some sort of criminal history or perhaps some sort of financial difficulties that might put pressure on them. So I do think that's something to consider, the background check and the credit check. And I do think it's a good idea that that treasurer have some sort of educational credentials or job experience in accounting or finance. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about a finance committee. And Andy, maybe this is a good time to try our first poll question.
Here we go.
For
All
our
right.
audience about whether
works.
they have a finance committee in their club. Do you want to try firing it up?
Here we go. Yeah, let's give it a shot.
Okay. So just a simple yes, no question. If you want to just answer that quickly, and then we'll just show what the results are right away.
All right. Can everybody see that?
Yeah. So we've got 2/3 without and 1/3 with a finance committee. All right. Thanks, everybody. So the Badgerland Striders that I'm one of the clubs I'm pretty involved with does have a finance committee. And as Andy mentioned, I'm the chair of that committee. And a finance committee can perform some really key functions for your club. One of the important ones is oversight of the treasurer. You know, again, the treasurer's got access to all the funds of the club. And so while we trust the treasurer keeping with good principles of internal control. We want to trust but verify. So what a finance committee can do is they could potentially do the monthly bank reconciliations, but certainly the finance committee can review the monthly bank reconciliations, make sure they get done, make sure they're in order, see if there's any questionable items. Another thing that a finance committee can do is perform an annual sort of audit, a review of the financial transactions that happen for the club. Review, do some document tracing. Start with the financial statements and work backwards and look at some of the original documentation supporting the financial transactions, kind of like, an audit that would be done in business. Again, just to confirm and verify that everything is accurate and nothing untoward is going on. And I think another thing that finance committee can do, and that the Badgerland Striders Finance Committee does, is help the treasurer with the workload. Being treasurer is a lot of work. And the finance committee chair could take the lead in putting together the budget. The treasurer is a member of the finance committee, and obviously they're involved, a key person in putting together that budget. But the finance committee chair can take the lead and be responsible for putting the document together and getting it to the board of directors for approval. Also, the annual F990, perhaps the finance committee chair could prepare that as well. And the other thing that your finance committee can do is review long-term financial commitments, lease agreements, contracts, and make recommendations to the board so that there's more than one person with a financial background, not just the treasurer looking at those things, but a group of people reviewing those long-term financial commitments.
Great.
Thanks, Andy.
Sure.
Okay, and again, continuing on with the finance committee, another valuable service the finance committee can perform is to review those financial statements. Either your monthly or quarterly financial statements. And that is an important service to the board of directors, because they can rely then on that finance committee and people who have a financial background having done a detailed review, and they can focus more on the big picture. Obviously, they have to make sure they understand the financial performance and financial position. But again, they can rely on the fact that committee's done a detailed review and looked at some of the, the ins and outs and the nitty gritty of doing the financials. And also that finance committee can look at the financial performance of each race that a club puts on. Some clubs I know may only have 1 or 2 races. The Badgerland Striders put on 12 events during the year, and most of those events have multiple distances. So there's a lot of races, and looking at that financial performance of each race and making recommendations and looking at, where the pricing should be and how we can leverage expenses and control expenses among the races, again, is something that a committee of people, the finance committee, including the treasurer, can really help with. And then the last thing I have listed here is if the club is fortunate enough to have some surplus funds, you certainly want to look at potentially investing those. Probably nothing too crazy or too risky. And of course, it's hard to get hard to get any kind of interest rate these days. But again, that finance committee can look at, okay, do we have enough money where we can perhaps, invest in some CDs or even perhaps some mutual funds. So again, I think, if your club does not have a finance committee, as most of your clubs do not, again, something to think about for oversight of the treasurer, as well as to help the treasurer and perform a good service for the board. You want to go to the next slide, Andy? Okay, so disbursements in terms of checking accounts, cash handling. Again, just some best practices to keep in mind. I've been in clubs where we kind of forget about those account signers at the bank, and somebody who was the treasurer 5 years ago is still listed as an account signer. So remember to keep those up to date. And in addition to the treasurer, who would have online access to checking accounts, you want to have the chair of the finance committee, as well as most likely the president of the club, also having online access, again, just so they can keep tabs on things. I think it's also a good idea that a club have a policy that any income that comes into the club has to go into a checking account of the club, not of race directors or board members. You don't really want to commingle the club's finances in personal accounts. And, if you're doing races and you still have race day registration where you take cash, one of the things we instituted in the Badgerland Striders a couple years ago is that we require a written accounting of all the race day cash, and it needs to be counted and verified by a second club member. Again, cash is one of those things that's easy to lose track of and susceptible to being misplaced or other activities. And so you do want to keep a close eye on the cash. You want to go to the next one, Andy? And then just to finish this topic, obviously, checking accounts need to be reconciled on a monthly basis. I think it's important to keep up with that. And somebody should review the work of the treasurer. If there isn't a finance committee, perhaps it's another board member who is tasked with doing that. I also think that whenever possible, it's better not to have members use their personal funds for club expenditures. Either do it through a club checking account or club issued credit cards. Again, I'll use the Badgerland Striders as an example. We used to have separate checking accounts for every single event that we had, and it just became too much to keep track of, too many checking accounts. And so we use club issued credit cards for those race directors. And then they don't have to be reimbursed for expenses. And of course, they're doing a lot of things online where, a credit card is required. And so those club issued credit cards have worked out really well. And again, final point, probably a good idea not to have checks made payable to cash. Next slide, Andy. Okay. And again, in the same vein of thinking about cash, when we talk about spending and disbursement policies, you know, again, I've been with clubs where nothing was written down. And I think you'll be best served by having it clear, written down, and enforced. You might want to consider requiring checks above a certain amount to be co-signed. You know, that can be difficult when, you know, we're dispersed from each other and a lot of things are done online. So it may not work for you, but you may want to give some thought to that. I mentioned club credit cards a minute ago, and I would highly recommend using credit cards instead of debit cards. Debit cards do not give you the protection against fraudulent charges like credit cards do. A few months ago, in my role as the state representative for Wisconsin, I conversed with another club about debit cards versus credit cards, and they switched from debit to credit, and they say that that's working fine. So I would highly recommend credit instead of debit. And again, though, you want to watch what's going on with those credit cards, which of course can be looked at online, you know, to just kind of keep track of the charges that are happening. And those club credit card holders, you know, again, they may charge a lot of things on that credit card. And in order to properly record them and to ensure that they're valid expenses, the treasurer is going to need documentation. And quite frankly, that's always a struggle, getting it in a timely manner. And so you may want to think and consider in your policy of requiring that the documentation be turned over to the treasurer within a certain time frame. And perhaps if somebody is a repeat offender, then they lose their credit card privileges. And perhaps then they would have to use their own funds and wait for reimbursement. And again, on those reimbursements, I think you'll have to be pretty strict about requiring receipts and requiring, you know, timeliness of requesting that reimbursement. Another recommendation would be things like PayPal and Square. Those I think work well for income. You know, when you're doing online registration and you don't want to take cash, you know, and I'm sorry, same day registration and you don't want to take cash, PayPal and Square can work really well. But things can get out of control and they're ripe for somebody to violate your spending policies if you allow those kind of accounts to be used for expenses, to give people access to those to spend the club money. So I think they're very useful for money coming in, not so much for disbursements. Next slide, Andy. Okay, budgets. And we'll talk towards the end about budgeting, you know, during this very uncertain situation that we're all in. But again, I've, you know, worked with clubs and been a member of clubs that did not do a budget, and others that do a very detailed job and take the budget very seriously. And I do think it's a good idea because it gives you your plan and helps you to think about, control your spending, and really think about how you're efficiently going to allocate the funds that you do have. And typically we're going to use, the current year projected results and maybe the prior year as a baseline. Think about our goals, what's going to be different, incorporate new things. At the Badgerland Striders, we've started really documenting our major assumptions underlying the budget, which has been very helpful. Next slide, Andy. And I think it's always a good idea to be conservative in budgeting revenue and also really in budgeting expenses. If you're going to err on the side of caution, underestimate those revenues and overestimate expenses. And obviously you want to make sure that your budget line items match up to your chart of accounts. One thing, especially if you have a lot of races, you're gonna want a budget for each race separately, the revenue and the expenses. You don't have to budget for every line item expense, like we're gonna spend this much on awards and this much on t-shirts, but just total revenue expenses, I think, can work. And as you're doing that, just make sure everything is in line. For instance, if race entrants are going to increase 10%, think about, okay, well, expenses will certainly increase. Maybe not 10% because some expenses are fixed, but a lot of the expenses are variable. So you want to make sure that those expense levels are in line with the number of registrants that you expect. If you're expecting you're going to have more runners, well, then expenses, don't forget to make those expenses higher as well. All right, next slide, Andy. And I want to talk to you a little bit about QuickBooks Online, but this is also another opportunity for us to do a polling question, Andy, if you're ready for that.
All right, here we go.
So this is a question about what software or method your club uses to produce financial statements.
All right, looks like we have a consensus here, so.
Okay. And lots of half of you are using QuickBooks Online, and we have from some Microsoft Excel, QuickBooks Desktop, and some other. All right, thanks everybody. And Badgerland Striders used to use QuickBooks Desktop and switched to QuickBooks Online. And it was a very good transformation. I've also used Microsoft Excel in other clubs as well, particularly in smaller clubs. But online is really helpful. And those of you especially using QuickBooks, the desktop version, I would encourage you to think about the online version, because you can have multiple users that have access. And you can restrict them if you want to just viewing and running reports as opposed to doing data entry. So for instance, in the Badgerland Striders, as the finance chair, I can't do data entry, but I can run reports, and I do. And the president can run reports as well and not do data entry. And the other thing that's really great with the online version of QuickBooks is that bank transactions, including credit card transactions, can be imported. And QuickBooks will sometimes recognize and know how to record that transaction. Obviously, it automatically records the cash side of it. It knows the cash side. And then you just go in and tell it where you want the other half of the transaction to be recorded. So I think the online is a really good option. It's only somewhere between $40 and $60 a month. And one of the things that another tip for you is if you have multiple races that your club is doing, there's a feature in QuickBooks, and this is in either version of QuickBooks, called classes. And you can use classes for each of your races. And then it's real easy to do separate reporting. It's real easy to do separate reporting for races or to aggregate it and do it by account. So classes are really, really helpful in tracking what's going on with your races. And again, regardless of what you use, if you have some software that you're buying, please make sure it's owned by the club, not the treasurer or some other board member. That's a resource for your club. All right, Andy, next slide. Okay, so financial reporting and financial performance reviews. I know some clubs do monthly financial reporting and others do quarterly financial reporting. I think either is fine. Whatever works for your club, I think you want to establish a due date. For instance, if you do quarterly financial reporting, you might want to have in your financial policy that due date is no later than, let's say, the end of the month following the end of the quarter. You know, maybe give the treasurer 30 days to get the financial statements done. Or maybe you want it 2 weeks after the close of the month or the quarter. But set that expectation, establish that due date in your policy. Probably want to do a balance sheet in addition to an income statement, so you can see those cash accounts and so forth. Again, I think income statements for races are very important. And you do need to provide at least a summary financial report to your club membership at least annually. You don't have to do it more frequently than that if you don't want to. Some clubs make it available to their whole membership, monthly or quarterly, and others just do it once a year. But please do that at least once a year. All right, next slide, Andy. A little bit more on financial reporting. Obviously, you want to compare your results of the current year to the prior year. You may or may not have a monthly or quarterly budget, but you can also show that annual budget, or if you update the budget during the year to an updated forecast or projection, you may want to show that as well. And again, these financial reports, if you have a finance committee, it's very helpful for the club and for the board members if that finance committee gets together, you know, perhaps just through email, maybe in person, maybe through Zoom, to take a little bit of time and ask the treasurer questions and really understand in detail those financial statements. Next slide, Andy, please. Okay, I think we've got another poll question here for you about donation policies, Andy.
All right. And here we go.
Yeah, we'll get the results in a moment here.
Yeah, seems like most people are responding. Okay, all right.
Okay, we're very much split. Yeah, okay. Thanks, everybody. So again, I think a best practice is to have a written policy and board approval of every donation. Again, I've seen where instances in a club where donations were, there was not a written policy or even a sort of verbally understood policy, and things were kind of up for grabs. You know, race directors made decisions themselves about donations from the proceeds of their race, or there were individual board members deciding on donations for, you know, charities near and dear to their hearts. And I think, again, with you want to have a thought out policy that is going to be in line with your club's vision and mission, support what you're trying to do, and, you know, again, have it thought out and each donation carefully approved. And you might want to consider for large donations, rather than just a simple majority approval, you might want something like a 2/3 approval. You know, if you get up into major donations. And again, that with that point about your club's mission, you know, while there are a lot of wonderful charities out there, you may want your policy. Many running clubs have a policy that says it's got to somehow be related to running or exercise, promoting health, something about what we're trying to do as a club. And as you think about donations and how much you're going to give, obviously make sure that you can afford it. You know, that it's not excessive. You know, even small donations can make a big difference. And so you don't want to get carried away with the dollar amount of donations if that's in any way going to harm the financial stability of your own club. And then, of course, people may want to donate to your club. So you may want to consider a gift acceptance policy, primarily, I think, to establish whether there are certain kinds of organizations that you don't want to accept funds from. There may be certain types that you just want to stay away from. All right, next slide, Andy. And of course, complying with local, state, federal regulations is really a key thing, and you don't want to get afoul of any of those rules. As a nonprofit, if you're all in nonprofit clubs, You have to do a 990N, which is a postcard or an EZ or a full Form 990 on an annual basis. And please make sure you do that. You know, if you forget, the IRS will, you know, probably 6 months later, send you a little nasty gram saying, hey, you didn't file this, you better get it done. But you don't want to get those letters from the IRS too frequently, because you could potentially lose your nonprofit exemption. Another key thing, and I will tell you, I've been involved with clubs that were not doing this when they should have been. 1099 miscellaneous for independent contractors, which many times comes into play for races, like if you have a DJ or band or a race announcer, professional race announcer, or maybe even your club has a consultant. Anyone who's not an employee that you pay $600 or more for services, you have to send them and a copy to the IRS, a 1099 miscellaneous. And what I've seen done in some clubs is you need the person's social security number in order to issue that. And so you don't pay them until they give it to you. And then again, that deadline is January 31st to get that 1099 miscellaneous form to those independent contractors. Next slide, Andy, please. And a couple more things. Every state is different on sales tax. In Wisconsin, pretty much everything is taxable. And what we do in the Badgerland Striders is we tell people that their entry fee includes the tax. So when somebody pays $30 to enter a race and it comes time to pay the sales tax, we back that out of the $30. That way we can have nice round numbers that we're charging people. So every state's different. Go to the Department of Revenue in your state, their website, or call them and make sure you know what the laws are in your state regarding paying sales tax. Because as a nonprofit, you're not exempt from paying sales tax on your income. You're likely exempt from paying sales tax on most of your purchases. So again, make sure that you use your federal ID number and let people know that you're a nonprofit and don't have to pay sales tax. So purchases generally are exempt, but income many times is not. So again, I'd urge you to find out what the law is in your state. And then again, something that's different depending on where you live. In Wisconsin, we pay property taxes on, you know, things like timing equipment and computers, and, you know, Badgerland Striders own a truck that they use for races. So there's, in the community, property taxes to pay on that personal property, that business property. So please seek out those laws. There's also usually some kind of annual filing you have to do in each state. I think Florida has some sort of form that has to be filed and a fee paid. Again, please know what is required in your state. Seek out that information so that you can be in compliance. All right, next slide, Andy. And now for the last few slides, I have a few slides about, okay, what are we going to do about planning for 2021 in these really, really uncertain times? Budgeting is hard enough in a normal year. And so, Andy, I think we have another poll question here, if you would.
Sure thing.
And this is about budgeting for 2021. We'll
All right.
see what the audience is planning to do. And we'll wait just a couple minutes and then we'll see what the group's plans are.
Okay.
Wow, 75% are going to budget. Awesome. Some never do a budget and some are, hey, who knows what's going to happen? So we're not going to do it. Okay, thanks everyone. So again, just really some food for thought because we're all trying to feel our way through this. You know, again, many times when you do a budget, you start with the prior year as a base and say, okay, what's different? Well, we obviously can't use 2020 as a base, and we probably can't use 2019 as a base either. We might not be at levels of participation in membership and races and sponsorship as we had in 2019. So it's going to be really tough to do a budget. I think we want to be more conservative than usual. And I think, you know, the finance committee for the Badgerland Striders is having a Zoom meeting next week to talk about putting our budget together. And I think what we're going to do is do multiple scenarios. A best case, a worst case, and sort of a maybe middle of the road. I guess you could call it, maybe it'll be an expected case, but something in between best and worst. So we can kind of see, you know, if things are like at a standstill for the first half of the year, let's say, then what does it look like? Maybe, or if things are, we don't have any races for the whole year, is that going to be our worst case? So looking at what it could be, how good could it be? What do we think is the worst it could be? And what is a middle of the road? I think is going to give us some good insight and help us plan. And again, I think even what if something happens that's even worse than the worst case? Do we have a contingency plan? And just thinking about we know things are not going to be normal when we look at any of our typical revenue streams. Next slide, please, Andy. Oh, and I think I also wanted to mention, I guess I'll put it here, maybe normally you don't do any cash flow planning, cash flow analysis, but perhaps if cash is a little tight in your club, you might want to do a cash flow analysis as well. And so, when we think about revenue, maybe we can be creative. And again, just some things perhaps to consider. Again, especially if your club has a pretty tight cash position and doesn't have big cash reserves. Maybe in 2021, as an inducement for members, you want to have a membership discount for, let's say, a 2-year or a 3-year membership. Get the cash now instead of later. Obviously, the downside there is you're not going to get the money later, but perhaps now is really when you need it. And so that could be something to think about if your cash reserves are low. And also, don't be afraid to ask for donations. You can do it you can do it just by maybe posting something on your club website. You could send out an email blast, put something in the newsletter. People who there certainly are some people who have been fortunate during the economic situation with the pandemic. And some people are still in a good financial position, and they may be more than happy to help your club out with a donation. So don't be shy about seeking donations. And if donations are made this year in 2020, there's a new IRS rule. Right now, it's just for 2020, where even if people are taking the standard deduction, which a lot of people are taking following the last change in the tax code, even those taking the standard deduction can deduct up to $300 in cash donations. So people would get a tax benefit with a donation to your club, again, fully tax deductible. Also, maybe there's a lot of clubs have been doing running challenges, so to speak. Doing things like saying, maybe from the city that your club is in to another city in the state, maybe it's 100 miles. And you do a month-long challenge for members to run 100 miles. Now, you might want to do that at no charge to your members to keep them engaged, but you also could think about charging a small fee and maybe having some prizes. So again, just think about what are those revenue opportunities that we could look at, especially if we're not going to get as much revenue as we normally do from races. And I think it's time to really tightly control expenses. It's probably not the right time to initiate a major new project. And if there's opportunities to cut administrative expenses as opposed to program expenses, obviously we always want to look at doing those administrative expenses as efficiently as we can. But especially now, look for opportunities to cut those. You may want to do even zero-based budgeting, where everything gets re-examined. You don't start with a baseline of here's what we normally do. And of course, things aren't normal. So you may want to examine everything that the club does and think about, is this something we need to spend money on right now? Or could we do this a different way? Could we put it on hiatus for a year and bring it back? And again, if, I mentioned a cash flow analysis, and if running out of cash is a risk, Think about that contingency plan that will allow you to survive. Next slide, Andy, please. And then races. You know, some of your clubs, races might be a really important part of your financial picture. Some maybe not as much. I'll tell you, in the Badgerland Striders, race net profit in a normal year like 2019 was almost 6 figures. So it's a lot of money that normally came into the club and helped finance a lot of programs for our members and the community. And so, boy, here's where we've got the most uncertainty there is in any area of our club. So obviously you have to know the local rules, and of course those are going to change. Sometimes they change by the day. So again, stay up on those. You may want to survey your runners. If you're thinking about, as you do your planning for 2021, if you're thinking, all right, well, maybe by the second quarter or the third quarter, we'll want to try to have some in-person races. Find out what safety measures your runners value and about their intention to participate. And then be honest about whether your club has the resources to put on a safe event. You know, some, as I think you know, some in-person events in different parts of the country are happening now. And most of those races are very much limiting the number of participants, spreading out the number of participants. I was reading something today about an upcoming race that it's gonna, I forget what distance it was, maybe a 12K, it was kind of an odd distance. It's gonna take 3 hours for all the participants to cross the starting line because they're gonna have a staggered start to keep people socially distanced. Think about whether your club can do that and how you would do that. And I think it's a safe assumption that race participation numbers are going to be down from 2019. So think about, maybe think about it by quarter. You know, again, just maybe you'll say Q1, we're going to assume no races. Q2, we're going to assume that we'll have some races with 50% of the people we did in 2019, because we'll have to cap it and some people might be leery of participating. Maybe in Q3, you're going to assume 75% of normal numbers. Again, it will depend on what's going on in your community, what you feel you can safely do as a club. And again, if things change, well, then you can adapt and do something different than what you budgeted. But that starting point and that exercise of planning, I think, is very helpful. And again, when you're looking at a budget for a race, if you're going to assume that race fees, you know, your income from a race is going to go down by 50%, expenses aren't going to be down 50% because some of them are fixed. So give that some thought as you're, again, budgeting for those races. And your club may decide that as a service to your members in the community, you'll put on a race and it's fine to break even or lose money. But be honest about whether you can absorb that and whether you want to do that and put on the effort. Again, some clubs will want to do that, and others may not want to or may not be able to take the risk of losing money on a race. So really think through that as you're planning races. And Andy, next slide. And I guess that's it. So again, sound financial management practices are always good, more important than ever. And I think for 2021 is really the time for clubs to be very conscientious and deliberate in the planning and conservative, but be flexible. Be ready to react as things change. You know, a budget isn't set in stone. But that process of thinking through what you might be able to do and what it results in financially, I think will help you be able to react and adapt as things change so that you can have a good outcome as best as you can, a good financial outcome in 2021. So that's all I have. Andy, do we have any questions in the?
We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
George, are you here? George had a question that.
Hi, George.
Yeah, that was about the finance committee. That there was some discussion in chat, but I think George, it might be good to throw it out there for Barb and hear her response to it live. So go for it.
Yeah, actually, Joe would answer like how many people on the committee, but I was just wondering, is there any particular number your favorite, prefer, like 4, 7?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think probably, in my opinion, at least 4, because you want some difference of opinion and perspective. So I think you probably want at least 4 and recognize one of those is going to be the treasurer, one's going to be the chair. So I think you need at least a couple people. And then I guess on the other end, my recommendation will be you don't obviously want too many. So, I think to me, the sweet spot is 5 or 6. And I would say, I wouldn't think too many more than 7 or 8.
Thanks, Barb. Great presentation.
Thanks, George.
Great. So it looks like KP had a question about 1099s. So KP, if I see there. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask Barb the question, that would be great.
Yeah. What is your opinion on an EIN business and a 1099 versus a person with a Social Security that would be a true 1099 contract employee?
I'm sorry, can you ask again? I didn't quite catch the beginning.
What is your opinion on issuing a 1099 to a business that functions under an EIN versus a true 1099 person that you would do with a Social Security number?
Yeah, okay, so for a company that has an EIN, if they are not incorporated, they can still have an EIN. If it's a service and they are not a corporation, you need to send them a 1099. And what I would say is
that just a True Corp or an S Corp or because there's many types of corporations. So.
Right. An S Corp is fine. And so any kind of like Inc., INC, including an S Corp. And what I would say is, if you don't know if they're a corporation or not, or if you should issue them a 1099, give them one. It doesn't
Always
hurt.
Come up at your local Secretary of State too, to see if they're an Inc. or not.
Yes, you can do that. Yes, absolutely. But when in doubt, give them a 1099. It doesn't hurt anything.
Okay.
Awesome. And then I think Joe, you had a question for Barb. So go ahead.
First, thanks for the presentation, Barb. And you
You're
mentioned
welcome,
earlier
Joe.
about setting level of reserves for your club. I was curious what your preference, what your approaches are. I know certainly it would look different with different clubs, different sizes, different situations.
Yeah.
But any kind of rules of thumb or your experience, I'd appreciate hearing.
Yeah. Yeah. And, also too, there's kind of a minimum. And then I think sometimes people worry about, oh, do we have too much cash? So let me address the minimum first. I think at least 6 months worth of ongoing expenses, and a year is probably better, is what I would say. That would, to me, that gives you a little bit of wiggle room and helps to, get through sometimes when the income is not coming in as normal. So I would say a minimum of 6 months and at least a year. And on the other end, I think there's almost no such thing as having too much cash. Now, when you have big cash reserves, you want to invest it. Don't leave it sitting in a checking account. Invest it. If you're not going to need it, if you've got, let's say, certainly more than 2 years of reserves, invest it. But when you've got that excess cash, as a nonprofit, you do have an obligation to use that money to further and to support your mission. So while you can have the cash, at the same time, you want to be finding, okay, how can we use this? What can we do for our members, for our volunteers, for our community to support running and wellness and exercise? So, you want to make sure then that you will use that cash in a way that supports your mission. Did that answer your question, Joe?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
So I think that's all the questions. I do want to say, I don't know if you guys can see Carol's avatar where she's giving a high five, but when you're facilitating questions, it looks like she's raising her hand. And so I keep seeing call on her. So it's really trippy in my role. It's a little bit, anyway. I think that might be everything. And if anybody else has anything, you can fire away right now. But first, I just want to thank Barb. I know some of our question people have done so, but fantastic presentation, incredibly timely. And thank you for tying it to, I think, a lot of questions that clubs are facing right now. So can't thank you enough. The recording should be up on our website probably by the end of the week. I'll make sure to send everyone a message. Thank you for hanging with us on the technical difficulties. Hopefully we didn't make that too hard for you to follow along with. And I know, Barb, I'm sure if anybody has questions, I can facilitate putting them in touch with you if they come up as we go along. So thanks, everyone.
Very good.
We'll be in
Thanks,
touch.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.